Hi, everybody. My name is Jordan Wall, the Executive Director for SARP. And I'm happy you can join us for our second learning session as part of our 2024 Recreation Professionals Week. I'm excited to be joined by Kris Garner of the Emotional Literacy Movement. And I had a chance to meet Kris a month or two ago, and she came highly recommended from Recreation Manitoba and some of the work she did with them at their annual conference. So really excited to hear from her today on her topic and what her group is doing in the field of nature and the impacts of nature-based recreation on health and well-being, and a lot more. So I won't go too deep into it. I'll turn it over to Kris. For those who are in attendance, the opportunity to drop some questions into the chat and ask some questions at the end of Kris's presentation, and we'll do our best to answer those and follow up on anything. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Kris.
All right, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. So yeah, thanks for joining me on today's session. So we'll be looking at the importance of nature and nature-based recreation for health and well-being. And just a quick introduction about myself. So my name's Kris Garner. I'm a former middle school educator. I taught grades 4 to 8 for many years in the public school system. And I left my career as an educator a number of years ago to start a business called ELM, or the Emotional Literacy Movement, which focuses on educating organizations, schools, and individuals on emotional literacy and how to understand and work with our biological needs in order to serve our overall well-being. So my work has been largely inspired by my own personal struggles with anxiety and depression, as well as working with youth who are impacted by trauma, those who are struggling with their own mental health, and the neurodiverse youth who are in my care whose needs were not being accommodated adequately in our current educational structures. I also had the pleasure of running a forest school program for 2 years in Manitoba. And so I directly experienced the benefits of that on my own students and my own child, who happened to be my student for 2 years. So that was a real benefit. I sort of snagged her along for the ride. So I've been working for about 8 years now to understand how our body biologically responds to the world around us and how we can develop systems and strategies that can keep us healthy in this increasingly urbanized and technology-driven world. I like to focus a lot on the why behind things, because for me, that sense of understanding why from this science perspective, for me, has created a lot more buy-in and understanding when I make decisions regarding how to maintain my health and well-being. So today's workshop is going to explore what nature does for our well-being and how we interact with nature from this science-based lens, and why it's crucial to nurture this relationship with nature from a young age and continue it through adulthood. So I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of statistics I'm going to share today, and that those were largely found through Florence Williams' work in her book, The Nature Fix, which is about how nature makes us happier, creative, and healthier. And so I want to acknowledge that the hard work of the people who've collated those resources in these easily accessible places. All right, so a little bit of a science lesson on our body and how our sort of nervous system functions here. So we're going to look at our body and nervous system through the lens of polyvagal theory. So polyvagal theory was a theory that was put forward by Dr. Stephen Porges in about 1996. And he looks at the importance of the vagus nerve, which is the longest cranial nerve in the body. It runs from the brainstem to through our organs, organ systems, all the way to our lower intestine. And he had a focus on this nerve specifically for our nervous system regulation and stress regulation. So this nerve acts as an information highway. It brings information from the brain to the body and the body to the brain. And just an interesting fact, 80% of the information actually goes from the body to the brain, and 20% is brain to body, which is why, when people say calm down, it really doesn't help us because we only have really a 20% impact of being able to calm our body just using our mind alone. So this nervous system evolved in 3 parts and throughout our evolution. So the first part to evolve is called the dorsal vagus, and it's that lower part of the vagus nerve. So it's below the diaphragm, and it evolved about 500 million years ago. And this part of our nervous system facilitates an immobilization response when we are faced with either an overwhelming situation, or we've been, in which case we feel that there's no hope of us fighting or flighting our way out of the situation, or we've been in fight or flight for so long that our body just cannot sustain that energy anymore, and we go into a collapsed response. So when we're in a dorsal vagus response, we feel numb, depressed, fatigued, feel brain fog, because our prefrontal cortex, which is the part of our brain that's actually responsible for reasoning, rationalizing, like learning and synthesizing new information, is actually offline, because all that energy has now been diverted to survival. And it's really asking our body to rest and recover. I kind of think of this part of our nervous system as our kind of human equivalent of playing dead. When we can't escape our situation or our overall stresses in any other way, the only hope that we sort of have is to kind of rest and hope the threat will pass, or that maybe we'll get enough energy to be able to fight or flight our way again. So this is this dorsal vagus. The sympathetic nervous system developed about 400 million years ago, and it's active when we face any real or perceived threat. So it doesn't have to be necessarily that we're under threat, but we could just, feel threatened. And this initiates this fight or flight response in our body. And when this fight or flight response is initiated, our, again, prefrontal cortex goes offline. So we have limited ability to problem solve, reason, rationalize, and learn new information. But it also releases adrenaline. So that's going to send a whole lot of blood and oxygen to all of the muscles and organs that are going to be necessary to initiate that fight or flight response. So our heart, our lungs, our arms, our legs, and it's going to also release cortisol. And what cortisol does to our body is it's going to it's going to raise our blood pressure, and then it's going to sort of take offline any systems that it doesn't really need to deal with the threat response, right? Because right now our body biologically is focusing on survival. And so we're going to see our reproductive system is going to cease to function optimally. Our digestive system is going to cease to function optimally, which is why, you're probably familiar with, when you get nervous about your big presentation and your stomach starts feeling funny. It's because that part is coming offline. That system is coming offline. Our endocrine system, which controls hormones, is going to go offline. Regular housekeeping of clearing the body of mutated cells, which our body does every day, all the time, is going to go offline. So we're going to start, if we are in a state of prolonged stress, we're going to see increases of cancer showing up in the body because that housekeeping is not taken care of. We're also going to see a altered immune system. So in the short term, we're going to actually have an anti-inflammatory response. So in the case that I'm fighting off a bear and I get a, surface wound, I'm not going to initially, I'm going to have an anti-inflammatory response, which is hopefully going to last long enough for me to escape the immediate threat. And then I can deal with the wound. It's going to stave off that immediate, it's going to help me temporarily. But the system is not designed to operate with prolonged ongoing stress. And so what happens when we are stuck in this sympathetic state is that we actually start to become more resistant to our white blood cells. And what we start to see is autoimmune diseases start to show up over time. So this is like super important for us to understand the impact of what living in this sympathetic nervous system state does to our overall health and well-being. The third part of our nervous system to develop is the ventral vagus, which developed about 200 million years ago. And it's only active when we feel safe. And here all our body systems are regulated and our prefrontal cortex is online. So we're able to, operate great in our work and physical life because everything is operating as it should and our body feels safe. And so this system actually operates in sort of a hierarchy, is that when we first detect threat, we'll move into this sympathetic state. And if we can't resolve the threat, the sympathetic state, eventually, if we're there long enough or we're too overwhelmed or we get tired, we'll collapse into a dorsal state. So if any of you have experience with anxiety and depression, this is quite literally, you feel anxious for a long time, and then eventually you kind of become depressed because you can't sustain that energy of the anxiety, and then you might come back up and feel anxious. So that's why it's pretty common to have, experience these two, anxiety and depression as sort of connected to one another. So this is how this source system works here. And so I want to, with that base knowledge, kind of look at, well, what does nature have to do this? How can nature help us recover from this like sympathetic activation that we had when we're faced with a real or perceived threat or ongoing stress in our life? So this is actually a picture of floor school at my that I ran on our property. Um, so this is the according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, the biophilia hypothesis is this idea that humans possess this innate tendency to seek connections with nature and other life forms. And Florence Williams talks in her book, The Nature Fix, about how we actually feel more at home in nature because we evolved here and we have an emotional connection to all living things. I like to think of it when I look at our nervous system as like even the youngest parts of our nervous system are 200 million years old. And we are not like, we're not iPhones. We're not getting a new update like every year. And so even though we are learning to accommodate our more urban lifestyle, we haven't actually become adapted to it because that actually takes a long time. And so this is actually quite new to us, the way that we're living nowadays, and we are seeing those impacts. So nature itself is actually like a natural balancer of our nervous system. Right? We interact with nature through our five senses, by observing landscapes and wildlife, by listening to bird songs and rustling leaves, by inhaling the scents of flowers and rain, by feeling the textures of plants and soil and savoring natural foods. And all these sensory experiences actually foster a really deep connection with the natural world and enhance our sense of belonging to it. So greenery itself, we actually have a deep connection with even just the color green as it appears in nature. Green is actually the easiest of all colors for our eyes to perceive. It's actually visually soothing and calming to the nervous system. And that makes sense because we've evolved living outdoors, right? When we inhale the scents of nature, whether it be water or pine or the humus, on the forest floor, we actually has a really powerful impact because on our nervous system, which is very fast acting. And this is because smell has a direct pathway to the brain. It actually marches right past the blood-brain barrier and right into gray matter, which is why air pollution is actually also quite toxic to us. So just an example of how powerful this is pinene, which is a component of the essential oils that pine trees create, acts as an anti-inflammatory. It promotes pain relief and relaxation. It aids in memory and respiratory function. It's been shown to reduce the spread of bacteria and viruses. And it does this by actually increasing natural killer cells in our body, which protect us from infection and diseases by quickly responding to threats in the environment. It's even been shown just by exposing infants to the essential oils of pine and conifers that their heart rate lowers by 4 points. So it's actually quite powerful. When I first learned this, I quickly got my diffuser out and was like dumping all the oil in just to help myself relax a little more. But even the smell of water actually instills a sense of safety in us. And this is because we actually used our sense of smell to find water when we had to. We didn't have taps and water easily accessible. So we actually have an instilled sense of safety and security when we smell water. Right. And as we become this more urban population, it's been documented that as a species, we're actually starting to lose our sense of smell over time because we're not using it for survival, which like actually kind of blew my mind a little. So beyond just the fact that seeing green is beneficial and, stimulates relaxation, it actually has, you may have heard of fractal patterns in nature. So this idea of like there's parts in mathematical proportion to the whole of like a repeating pattern. Like when you think of looking at pine cones or some flowers or succulents. But we even see these in like fern leaves and then the small details in like the veins within a leaf, right? So nature is largely made up of these fractal patterns. And it was actually discovered that our eyes, when scanning our environment, actually move in a fractal pattern. And so nature, when we view nature as opposed to man-made urban environments, it's actually quite literally easier on our eyes. So stress reduction actually becomes triggered because the fractal structure of the eye is actually matching the fractal structure that is being viewed. So its nature itself is visually more relaxing. Additionally, sunlight triggers the release of dopamine, and it's been very well documented that people who are sick in hospital actually require less pain medication and have significantly shorter stays if they're placed by a window, particularly if there is greenery nearby. And so these documents of viewing nature has been well studied, and it's even been shown to have benefits. But we're just looking at pictures of nature, which you might notice if you go into certain medical places or any place that have pictures of nature around us. That's because there is actually a documented benefit just to viewing nature, even if you're not out there, though not quite as strong as if you were actually immersed in nature. And so, like revisiting water, water actually triggers our parasympathetic nervous system. So it brings us into this calmer and more meditative state. It induces a sense of well-being by actually increasing blood flow to the brain and the heart. And trees and water are shown to be the most two powerfully impactful elements of nature for our well-being. So, if you have a, fountain in your yard, or you have a river nearby, just being able to get out and immerse yourself in those sounds of nature has a huge impact on your nervous system. And even bird song itself is associated with alertness and safety. So when we don't hear birds, biologically, we actually become more hypervigilant because when there are no birds, it means there's danger nearby. And it's interesting because we're actually so attuned to bird song that our brains are actually wired to be very specific as to what kind of birds actually instill safety and what ones that don't. So, the ones that have this melodic bird song gives a sense of safety and stillness, but scavengers, which come after everything's dead, tend to actually raise our heart rate. And, because that does not instill safety. So, the sound of crows cawing versus, the larks singing in the trees is going to have a different impact. And sadly, though, we're noticing as a species, and more, especially those of us living in these urban centers, that we're kind of experiencing this almost learned deafness by tuning ourselves out of nature. Like we'll go for our nature walks and we'll have our ear pods in as we listen to our, audiobook or our music, but there's so much benefit to being able to actually listen to the environment around us. And so in addition to just those sensory pieces here, nature's been shown to enhance our immune function, reduce inflammation, and actually increase our activity levels. And so it's been shown to reduce stress, lower blood pressure, improve mood. And because of these things, it also reduces inflammation in the body. And in one study, extended time in nature, so say taking about a 2-hour hike a day over a 3-day period, increase natural killer cells in the body, which protect us from disease and infection by about 40%. And that boost lasted beyond that weekend, but actually lasted for a full 7 days and was still present to some extent, about 15% higher or so than people who walked in cities over a month later. So it has long-lasting impacts. And these differences or this boost was not seen. It was seen basically not almost very minimally if you walked in urban environments with no trees, no nothing, and a little bit more if you're walking in parks. But the best, boost for your whole immune system is to actually be out in forests. It's also been shown that people who exercise in the forest and immerse themselves in nature actually achieve better results with their physical health and are more likely to continue exercising than people who do not participate in physical activity out in nature. As for our mental health, it decreases, we see an increase or a decrease in anxiety and depression, improved focus and creativity, and overall increased mental health and well-being. So there's a man named Yoshifumi Miyazaki, and he's a physical anthropologist and vice director of the Center for Environment, Health, and Field Sciences at Chiba University in Tokyo. And he measured leisurely forest walks compared to urban walks. And what he discovered was that the forest walks decreased cortisol levels by 12%, They decreased sympathetic nervous system activity by 7%. And there was a 1.4% decrease in blood pressure and 6% decrease in heart rate. So pretty significant. And even on winter walks, I'm from Manitoba, you're from Saskatchewan. We know how hard those winters can be. But even on winter walks, when participants came back from the walk and said they did not enjoy themselves, they hated being out in the winter, they still measured better on short-term memory and tests for attention. So even if you're out in nature and you're grumbling against the elements, it's still actually having a benefit to your nervous system. And it's also been shown that when we walk in nature versus walking in the city, we're actually less likely to ruminate and obsess over negative thoughts. So we actually kind of give our brains a little bit of a break. Creativity has been shown to be increased by 50% after just a few days in nature. So if you have a book that you're going to write, I highly recommend you find a cabin to get out to. And studies by the University of Sussex by George McCarran, who's a professor there, his research found that sorry, I'm just looking at the subject. He's focused on the research of economics of subjective well-being. That's his title. And you conclude that on average, people who are significantly happier if they spend more time outdoors or in green or natural habitats versus being in urban environments. So across the board, the studies have shown getting outside is just going to make you happier. And I think one thing that's important is sometimes when I've looked at this, I think, well, maybe our lives are just more stressful now because we have this ongoing stress where before evolutionary in our history, we would encounter the natural disaster, or we'd encounter the threat to our survival, or in that immediate moment, maybe a predator, but maybe it wasn't this ongoing, always micro stresses that we're experiencing. But I think the fact is that stress has always actually been in our past. It's always been a part of our lives. But because we're more attuned to our environment, we're actually able to recover and come back into balance more adequately than we have been able to now that we've been a lot more dissociated from our environment. And there's a lot of reasons why this is hard. And so since 2008, we've actually officially become an urban species. So the majority of people all live in urban centers. And I think the prediction is, and I might be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure it was by 2050 that 70% of humans will be living in urban centers. And so that's pretty huge, right? And so while we've seen this significant increase in quality of life in some areas, like advancements in living conditions and medical procedures and interventions, we've also seen an increase in mental health challenges. And I personally think, and a lot of other people who've been researching this trend, think that part of this is because of our evolutionary need for nature, and the fact that it is not congruent with these urban lifestyles that we lead now. So part of this is the increased use of technology. So not only does it negatively impact our cognition because we're staring at screens, but exercise is widely known to be the most important factor in age-related cognitive decline. And as we become more tech absorbed individuals, we actually get out and exercise less. And additionally, in that, if we even take screens away, technology even sort of along the lines of like, how much energy did it require us for do our laundry? How many 100 years ago versus what the energy requires us to do our laundry now. There's a lot of technology that, we take for granted on a daily basis that just required a lot more effort for us in order to survive, and that we're physically engaged with and outside with, because you weren't doing your laundry in the kitchen or inside if you were slopping all that water around. Access to green space is a huge issue. So many people actually don't have access to green space, and studies are showing that if green space is to be used, we actually need to have it pretty easily accessible to us. And they've done some studies which have demonstrated that even if you account for discrepancies in income, that there is increased violent crimes, increased health problems, and lower life expectancy in neighborhoods that do not have green space. And it's not just because, greenery is relaxing to us and helps our nervous system, but nature actually draws us together. And so like, I'm assuming you're in Saskatchewan, you're not far from Manitoba, but here in Winnipeg, When summer comes, the parks are full, and people are out, and we're connecting to one another. And when winter comes, we all kind of move back into our own holes and hibernate, right? But green spaces draw us out together. And it actually means that we connect with one another and we get to know one another, and we actually create safer communities because we know our neighbors and we're looking out for each other. And so that's another benefit here. Noise pollution has been doubling every 30 years. And just because you become accustomed to it, it actually doesn't mean that you're not hearing it and responding to it. So even when people are sleeping, they've been shown to respond to trains, planes, traffic noises. So it is being registered in your body. And living on a flight path has actually been shown to contribute to sleep disorders, to mood disorders, increased stress, a lot of physical and mental health problems, which I became acutely aware when in April they decided to, they're redoing the longest tarmac at the Winnipeg airport. So they've re-diverted the flight path over my parents' house, which never used to have a flight path over. And it's pretty constant now. And I could feel my whole body every time a plane was going over just clench up, right? So I'm not accustomed to that noise, but I could notice the impact on my nervous system. And all of these things, like these little micro stresses, right, they add up over time in the body because we're not adapted to dealing with this ongoing stress. Certainly, even 100 years ago, 200 years ago, like noise pollution was not something we were dealing with. We didn't have planes flying overhead. And so the stress, this like steady stress of urban life, right, actually changes the way that our brains function, right? And it actually increases odds of anxiety and mood disorders and schizophrenia just by being present consistently in our urban environments. And so I'm going to read to you guys a couple really startling statistics out of the US that hit home for me here. So one was that preschoolers are the fastest growing market for antidepressants in the United States. Teenagers today have 5 to 8 times more clinically significant scores for anxiety and depression compared to young people born in the 1950s. In 1999, or since 1999, the US suicide rate has increased for nearly all groups, with the steepest rise being 200% amongst girls aged 10 to 14. Childhood obesity rates have tripled, and allergy and asthma rates have increased dramatically in the last 3 decades. And 1 in 10 children has a vitamin D deficiency, and 2/3 are now considered vitamin D insufficient. And so much so that rickets, which is a disease caused by vitamin D deficiency, which was virtually eradicated, is now making a resurgence in the UK and the US, and this incidence has quadrupled in the last 15 years. So we are seeing, like, in addition to these issues here, we're seeing increased vision problems, increased loss of smell as a species, and a lot of other significant impacts due to this lack of interaction with nature, which actually helps our body to reset and recalibrate in the face of stress. And in urban environments, we're sort of constantly juggling these numerous tasks that require intense effort to filter out distractions and to concentrate. And this relentless stimulation and multitasking, it actually exhausts our frontal lobes because they have to work so hard. And this exhaustion eventually leads to psychological distress. Conversely, nature actually provides a setting with fewer demands to our attention, and it actually allows our frontal lobes to relax and recharge, which allows us to recover from stress. I don't know if any of you here are familiar with Brené Brown, but she was interviewing psychotherapist Esther Perel, and she said this quote, which to me resonates really strongly here, was, are we having a mental health crisis, or are we having a mental health response to a crisis? And for me, like, our bodies are responding to these environmental stresses and current social structure stresses, which are not actually in alignment with how we have evolved to survive and to thrive. But there are some things that are being done locally and around the world. So this is these pictures are actually from the forest school that I ran here. So children learn through exploration. Okay, so we when children engage in nature exploration, they actually engage all of their five senses and all of their muscles, right? They're climbing trees, they're digging down in holes, there's these tactile senses and the smell and the sensory senses of being able to be immersed in nature. And this has been shown to actually have an impact on even gender-based play. So when you look at a playground at a school, which does not have this natural nature forest element, you actually see that the boys tend to run around and be very active, and the girls kind of group and are not as physically active. But it's been shown that when you put these kids in a forest, that they all actually, this levels out and they all become equally engaged in their senses. And I see that in my own daughter too. She does not, she hates sports. She doesn't like anything that is structured and physically active in that regard, which is what her typical, school will provide her with. But if you put her out in the forest, she will be up and down trees. She'll be making forts, and she's highly engaged. And just an interesting thing that I learned when I was doing this as an educator was found this statistic on how kids are more likely to get injured on play structures than they are playing in forests. So this idea that we've tried to make things safer by having these play structures we made is actually, it's not really informed, really. But we learn through play, right? We learn through playing in nature. Learning is not limited to a classroom. I believe that we have an innate desire to learn, and we just need to be placed in the inspiring environments that help that to emerge. And so when I was working with kids in our own programming, we did gardening. We learned about science by working with the soil and through the bugs that we saw there and the changing seasons and what was happening on the land. We studied the plants on the land, and we had an apothecary class. So we learned about what were the benefits of these plants, what were the dangers of these plants, what they'd be used for. We make tinctures and oils and salves and things that they could use. So they were learning to interact with the land in a way that was beneficial, and also deeply educational. We did tool use. Some of our kids used axes and they used knives, and yes, they were 8 years old, but they were fully able to learn how to risk assess for those potential hazards and use them appropriately. And so what I saw from my own child was a kid who actually, before being immersed in this environment, she didn't even like the feeling of grass on her feet. Bugs were scary. She didn't like to go outside as much because it just felt like an overwhelming experience for her. But now she's far less likely to grab a device and far more likely to head outside to play because she's excited about what's out there. She has an intimate relationship with the land. She knows that when the seasons or the weather changes, that it's going to change the scope of play outdoors. And instead of looking at goes and go, oh, well, it's really lousy weather, I'm not going out today. She goes, oh, it's a bit of lousy weather. I need to put on my full rain suit. I'm going to need my boots. And she knows how to prepare herself for that environment so she can engage. And the seasons dictator play. So it's like, oh, it's time for maple tree tapping, or it's time for snow fort building, or it's time for gardening or campfire cooking or water play because the spring melt is bringing water through the land. And so she has this deep intimacy now that she calls back to. And actually, it's her time was so impactful that now, even in January in public school, I still can't get her to stop wearing her socks pulled over her sweatpants because she's wearing them like that just in case the ticks are out. So, so she's been learning to adapt her environment. And there's long-term benefits to this. So not only does early interactions with nature foster physical, emotional, and cognitive development, but it's been shown that if we develop a relationship with nature early in life, it actually instills in us a desire to return to nature. And sadly, we're seeing that lacking in people who do not have that relationship at an early age. They don't hear that call to get out into the woods, or go to the lake anymore. Outdoor nature-based play also encourages risk assessment rather than risk avoidance. And this has been, actually huge for my own personal parenting as well as a teacher, but this allows students to develop this self-confidence and ability to solve problems. So for instance, every spring I live on land that has a creek that runs through it, but it only runs full of water for about 3 weeks in the year. And that's because All the farmers' fields drain through our property towards another creek that's at the base of our property. And so for 3 weeks, when the spring melts happened, there's a bunch of kids who live nearby, and they all run out and they all want to play in this water. And it's ice cold because, of course, it's spring melt. In some areas, it can be quite deep. And so, as opposed to saying, you can't play in that, it's dangerous, we do a risk assessment. So we go, well, what are the benefits of you playing out here? And they'll say, oh, we're going to race boats. We're going to have so much fun. We're going to learn to trust ourselves more. And they'll list all the benefits of playing out in the water. And they'll go, okay, well, what are the risks of you playing out in the water? And they'll say anything from, well, you can even drown in a puddle inch of water. So drowning is always a risk. Yeah, okay. I could get really wet, and it's cold out. So I could, get really sick and cold if I don't take care of myself. And then I say to them, well, okay, so what are you going to do to mitigate those risks? How are you going to handle that? And they'll make a plan. So they'll go, okay, well, I'm going to make sure I have a change of clothes readily available so that if I do get soaking wet, I'm going to come in, I'm going to change. I'm going to make sure I have the right gear to play out here. So I'm going to have my rain boots. I'm going to have, probably going to additionally have plastic bags in my boots. And I'm going to do everything I need to do to keep warm and dry. And another risk thing that the kids on the area have put in place is when I go and play in this water, I'm going to have a long stick, and I'm going to test how deep the water is before I go in it, because we know it can suddenly get deep. And if I don't get, I won't go anywhere that is past my knees. And so this is the ways that they have decided they're going to address the risks. And this has become such a familiar way of doing things now that I almost never tell my child, don't do that, or don't. I just go, remember to risk assess, because she knows if something happens, I'll ask, well, what would your risk assessment tell you? And the other day she ran in the house because she was playing outside, and we had tons of wind through our property. It blew down some big branches off a tree, which is really exciting because now, fort building can take on a whole new level. And but some of them are still kind of attached, and they're trying to get them down, and the wind was whipping them around. And so they ran in the house, a bunch of the girls, and they said, we're just getting some extra sweaters to layer ourselves up because we risk assess and we might get scratched by those branches. So we're layering up more. But they had just taken it upon themselves to do their own risk assessment, which is something we want kids to learn in life, whether it be hazards in nature or even a relationship you're getting into, to go, what's the benefits of this relationship and what are the risks? And, how can I protect myself and take care of myself? So we want to nurture that confidence and that ability to navigate challenging situations, rather than trying to bubble wrap anyone and keep them from being able to experience that freedom and that learning. I also saw huge impacts on the neurodiverse youth in my class. I had 19 students, 2 of which were on the autism spectrum, 4 with ADHD, diagnosed ADHD, 3 who had struggled with anxiety and depression so severe that they hadn't been in the classroom for several years. And additionally, this was 2021, so all the kids were still going through the impacts of lockdowns that were coming and going, and how this was impacting their mental health. And what I saw here was a reduction in stress levels across the board. Students who struggled to be in my class were showing up. So we'd increased participation, we'd increased attendance, we'd increased risk-taking that moved beyond just our class or our outdoor environment, but actually carried over to when we would sit down and do seated classroom instruction. They were actually able to maintain their focus longer, and take more risks in their learning. So it actually translated quite well. And so these nature-based spaces actually just provide a sense of ease and safety in our environment, which is just biologically within us, right? And it's actually been shown to be so significant that when they've conducted studies around ADHD in nature, they've seen that compared with staying indoors, ADHD symptoms were reduced threefold by outdoor nature exploration. And I appreciate what I see in Finland. Finland, even in their public schools, for every hour inside, they go outside for 15 minutes. So they're constantly making sure that there's that reconnection to nature. And we need to encourage this at a young age, as I said, because otherwise we are seeing children and adolescents now who have no experience in nature, and they perceive it as gross or as scary. And then we're now denying them the benefits of nature and robbing them of a resource that supports their health and well-being. which they sorely need, especially as, times are changing and there's even unknown stresses that we still have yet to quite fully understand. So how much time do we actually need? This is the nature pyramid from a company called Shift, which is a search engine for business sustainability resources. And this was sort of informed by the work by Florence Williams from the Nature Fix and Tanya Deklakop, who's the Biophilic Cities Project. And so biannually, we need like a multi-day excursion in wilderness with no urban intrusion, so no cell phones. On a monthly basis, a weekend per month, just restful nature areas, so national parks with minimal urban intrusion. Weekly, we can visit bigger city or wilder city or cities, provincial or regional parks, waterways, but try to have less urban intrusion. So further away from the street noise and traffic, minimal time on your phone taking pictures of nature, but just immersing yourself in nature. And daily, just taking time to get outside 30 minutes a day, fresh air, daylight, garden, even just being outdoors. We need a minimum, though, of 5 hours a month, no matter how you get it, just to not become clinically depressed is an absolute necessity for us. So how is this sort of showing up around the world? We're seeing the increase of forest schools. They originate in Denmark and are now making their way around the world sort of globally. Usually they're typically available up to grade 3, but there are some places where they have been working to create forest school infused pedagogy in the later years. Japan has a process of relaxing by immersing yourself in forests called Shinrin-yoku, which is forest bathing. In Nordic countries, I'm going to mispronounce this, but Friluftsliv, so this open air living philosophy, is about integrating nature into our daily lives, so much so that businesses and organizations in Nordic countries, some of them have benefits or incentives for their people in their organizations to walk or bike to work. They might host company meetings outdoors. But they have a focus on making sure that this open air living concept is a part of their life. And an increase in urban green spaces and social forestry, which is designing spaces and supporting natural environments with this aim to make nature more accessible and sustainable. So it's not just, here's our protected nature place, don't let any humans go there because we're trying to protect it, but it's how do we actually create these sustainable places in nature and have it as a social element for everyone to engage in for health and well-being. So how can we do this? What is this in it for us? And I'm sure you will come up with many other ways. And but walking or biking to work or wherever you need to go in lieu of alternative transportation, if that's possible for you. I live in the country, so if I were to walk or bike anywhere I needed to, get my things like groceries would not be possible for me, but opting for outdoor activities over indoor activities. So even if you're meeting a friend for coffee, like sit outside instead of indoors. If you can do a work meeting outdoors, do that. If you can't get outdoors, sit near a window, right? That's going to actually have a huge impact. There's a reason why the window offices are coveted, right? Because actually you do feel better in them. Gardening has huge benefits. Microbes in soil are antibacterial, they reduce stress, they lower blood pressure, have been shown to be antiviral and even cancer fighting. So if you can get your hands dirty, all the better for you. Taking the scenic route to work, if you have to drive, is going to be overall better for you, even if it is a longer drive. And statistically, there's actually less car accidents on tree-lined streets, probably because everyone's so chill, and relaxed as they drive down their beautiful tree-lined streets rather than the freeway. So you can also engage in guided activities and experience the benefits of nature this way. So whether it be forest bathing or ecotherapy, which are guided outdoor excursions aimed at immersing yourself in the therapeutic benefits. And sleeping with the window open, keeping your blinds open so that you wake to the sunshine. I like to keep my window open at night so I can hear the rustle of the leaves or the rain or whatever's happening outside, and the birds when they start chirping at 5 in the morning. Take your earbuds out when you're going on a walk, avoid unnecessary noise that negates or cancels out the benefits of the natural environment, and just make a commitment to being outside on a regular basis. So Miyazaki, who we had quoted earlier, noted that throughout our evolution, we've actually spent 99.9% of our time in nature. So our physiology is adapted to it still. And during everyday life, a feeling of comfort can be achieved if our rhythms are synchronized with that of the environment. And so before I do a little conclusion, we move right to some questions. I want to just invite you to grab like a piece of paper and take even like 1 or 2 minutes to just jot down what are some things that you could do. Like, what are some adaptations you can make to your life, whether it's through your own work that you do, or if it's through just your personal life that can bring more elements of nature into daily life for you. And you're welcome to steal from my list as well. It's not on the list, but one thing I've also do is that if I'm feeling sick and I can't do anything, or even just mentally drained, I will just go lie outside. Like, I will just pull a blanket out there and I will just lie and let nature take do its work on me in the way that it needs to, instead of lying in my bed. So if you even have a place where like, "Oh, I can rest here," you know, then all the power to you there. So yeah, sort of in conclusion, like the more time we spend in nature, the greater it is for our well-being. So I hope today's workshop sort of provide a little bit of an understanding on the critical role that nature actually plays on our health and well-being, and maybe a bit of inspiration about how we can practically apply this, whether to our own personal lives and work, or maybe to the offerings in our workplace. And so I hope that for you, that you find some time, well, in the near future, but really all the time, to be able to reconnect with nature and understand and feel its personal benefit to you. And I also want to acknowledge that for those of you who are creating and providing these opportunities for outdoor recreation, like, thank you so much, because it is a huge service to our communities and it really, really makes a difference. And so with that all said, yeah, I'll just open up our any questions that you might want to bring forward here. It's a lot of information.
Well, thanks, Kris. It is super valuable information too. So I know Stephanie just kind of posted a note in the chat here. She had to run to her meeting, but just kind of mentioning that her appreciation and and realizing some of the benefits of time in nature. So I think very appreciative from her perspective. I just had a few questions, and others can jump
Yeah.
in as well if they've got any. Like I said, it can just come off mute if you'd like to, or put it in the chat. I'm just wondering, have you seen any good examples of green space usage in some of these urban communities that have limited access? Just for thought in your travels, have you seen things that might help inspire those of us who are sometimes in charge of leading that programming and or making use of limited green space, as you mentioned?
Yeah. Well, I have seen one thing that has been a huge resurgence around in Winnipeg lately. I'm not sure how you've experienced it in Saskatchewan, but we've seen a lot of community gardens show up, and a lot of them have even been along like greenways, like along the highways, and they've wound bike trails through there. So at one point in time, a school that I worked at actually was close enough now to didn't have really too much access to green space before then, but once they put in these community gardens as these trails, we were actually able to utilize them in our classroom and be able to go and catch frogs and be able to engage in gardening practices. I think in the inner city, I know where we are anyways, it's still a huge struggle. I'm not seeing as many green spaces, or at least not many green spaces beyond a lawn.
Mhm.
Um, but there are a lot happening. Like Singapore is a good example of they've been putting in like just urban gardens. They just been going vertical. And so we are seeing more like rooftop gardens as well. People who are I know even laws have been building codes have been changed a bit in Manitoba to accommodate green roofs and things like that. Um, but yeah, you do have to, it's almost like get on Google Maps and kind of look at where are the green spaces and how do you get to them? Because often we're just not aware of them. But anywhere along rivers usually has even monkey trails that are in there just from man-made as opposed to even just city, created spaces.
Perfect. Thanks. I know Alara has a note kind of in the chat as well. She says she has no questions, but thank you for the insightful presentation. And she's just wondering where she can find the recording to share with her colleagues. So I can answer that one. We will follow up with an email for SARP members in the next coming weeks, but we'll also have it available on our website. So we do have a resources section where all the webinars and recorded sessions like this are contained. So you will be able to find it there and share it accordingly. And then I guess, Kris, just to remind everybody as well, just to find more information on Elm, can you just let everybody know where to go for that?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's just www.emotionalliteracymovement.com. And so I do workshops on a number of elements. This is one of them, but also on just understanding how our nervous system functions and how to work with our nervous system, say to calm that sympathetic response and how to deal with when you're in a dorsal collapse and bring ourselves back up to ventral. I also have some classes on understanding and honoring our own capacity, and actually even specifically as they relate to working in nonprofit sectors and that require a lot of focus on volunteers and their labors of love. And we want to give so much, but also it needs to be sustainable for us. And so how can we live a life that is, following our hearts and our passions and also understanding and honoring our limits and learning how we can find more balance with the demands of our life with what we need to bring our nervous system that sense of ease and calm and balance so we can remain healthy and full of vitality.
Perfect. And so I have one more question. I'm not sure if there'll be other ones, but knowing that our recreation professionals kind of cover a lot of different broad areas in our province, and including culture and community recreation, therapeutic recreation, and sport and tourism, amongst others. Do you see some obvious opportunities for rec leaders in the province and similar to your province in Manitoba to be able to better connect with nature in our communities? And maybe more specifically with youth, but I think any kind of community programming that we're doing or working with clients, do you see some obvious opportunities in some of the work you're doing?
Yeah, I think one thing is we need to get past this idea of basically if it's not a good sunny day, that it's not a good day to go outside. Like, of course, there are some more dangerous inclement weather, but for the most part, we just need to understand where to get the right gear. And so I would actually highly recommend if you're going to buy outdoor gear, like for children's outdoor gear, look at where the Danish forest schools are buying their gear. Because we have learned the hard way that waterproof and water resistant are not the same thing at all. And so understanding where you can find the appropriate gear and just saying to people, like, we're going to go out regardless of the weather and we're going to learn how we can, become more acquainted and see the benefits. So I think not seeing weather as an obstacle, but rather just having a plan for how things can move forward. Um, if you have the option of, working in a space that there's a little bit of fluidity, say you're teaching a yoga class, you can, of course, yoga in the rain, is not, or snow is not really as relaxing, but maybe you have the option of going, okay, this class is happening every week, but if it's nice out, we will be meeting outside at this space, right? And just have the option to move it. And so, when at all possible, trying to bring things outdoors, just to help people build that relationship to those outdoor environments. And even, one of the things I was actually having a conversation with my mother about the other day was that nature has become really inaccessible to people unless you're of a certain like socioeconomic status. Like now in Manitoba, like we used to have a train that used to go to Grand Beach to go to the beach, but if you don't have a car, you can't get out to our parks and you can't get out to the beach, right? So we need to be providing opportunities to help people who do not have means to access these spaces with the resources to do so, because otherwise it becomes, only those who are privileged enough to have a vehicle and the finances to support that are able to actually get out into nature, which is sad. Especially because we don't have here in Canada, we have, we have parceled out property, what's private and what's not private. Whereas in a lot of like Europe, like in Scotland and the Nordic countries, they have something called the right to roam. So it doesn't matter who owns the property. You're allowed to walk on any forested property and even camp there, so long as you do not interfere with the wildlife or damage the property. And it's our innate human right to roam. And we don't have that here. So how can we make nature more accessible for people who in those urban centers who don't have the means to get out to those places? I think is really important to look at. And one thing I noted, I just realized I forgot to mention is that neurodiversity often present very similar to trauma in some of the ways that our body becomes adapted to our environment, like sensitive to lights or sounds. And so when we actually create these more nature-based experiences or neurodiverse informed spaces, we're actually also kind of hitting two birds with one stone by creating more trauma-informed spaces. And so there is huge healing benefit, right? We actually hit a large group of people who are needing those extra supports when we put these resources in place.
Perfect. Well, unless there's other questions, Kris, I just wanted to express our gratitude for you joining us. I thought this was very informative, and I'm sure our members and recreation professionals across the province that view this will agree. So thanks again for being part of our 2024 Recreation Professionals Week. And for those of you who are viewing this at a later time, if you're interested in learning more, obviously you can go to the Elm website. But if you're interested in doing something that's a bit more specific with Kris, let us know at the SARP office. If there's enough interest from those around the province, we'll certainly look at and maybe come up with future sessions and other ways to connect with Kris and her association. So thanks again, Kris, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate being here and have a great week.